We're studying Galatians, and we've been doing it now since, a few weeks now. And if you remember, I just want to do a quick recap. And by the way, if you have missed any, if you've been, say, in New Zealand or Australia, you can catch up on YouTube, and hopefully the bulletins will point to where you can get that from. But if you remember, the church had been, in Galatia, had been persuaded by a group of outsiders to veer away from this gospel message that they had previously accepted from Paul, and they'd gradually returned to sort of the Jewish law. So in this letter, Paul is trying to persuade them to return back to the true gospel. And Paul spends the first couple of chapters giving his testimony, and he tells the church of his life as a model Pharisee, obedient to the Jewish law. And he explains how Jesus revealed himself and the truth to him on the road to Damascus. And then he explains that how after his conversion, God calls Paul to be an apostle to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. So then we got to chapter 3. "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you?" And Paul is asking the church at Galatia to look and remember how they've got there in the first place. "Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law, or by believing what you heard? Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh?" So Paul seemed gobsmacked. How could they turn their back on Jesus and return to try and do good in their own strength? And we heard from Ted a couple of weeks ago that Paul then goes back to the Old Testament to make his case. And Paul compares the promise given to Abraham and the covenant of law given to Moses. And he explains that Christ is the fulfillment of the promise given to Abraham to bless the world through his offspring. Law was just added as a temporary measure to the Jewish people. And last week, Ashley highlighted some of the advantages we have as those who inherited God's promises as his children. And I want to continue that today by looking at chapter 4, and it goes on almost seamlessly into chapter 4. So if you've got Bibles, otherwise it's on the board. Chapter 4, verse 1. I thought I'd get all chapter 4 done today. I've got about 12 verses. So, okay, but it's not lots of notes, honestly. But Galatians 4. What I am saying is that as long as an heir is underage, he's no different from a slave, although he owns the whole estate. The heir is subject to the guardians and trustees until the time set by his father. So also, when we were underage, we were in slavery under the elementary forces of this world. So according to Paul, the Jewish people were kept, in effect, like slaves under the law, until the promise given to Abraham was fulfilled, until Jesus. But then Paul says something which isn't very easy, is it, to put into modern language. He likens the slavery under the law to slavery under the elementary forces of the world. Now, NIV adds the word spiritual, so the phrase becomes, we are in slavery under the elemental spiritual forces of the world. So what does this mean? What are these spiritual forces? How do they enslave us? At the time of Paul was writing this letter, the majority of the people that lived in the Middle East were pagans. We know what pagans are. It just means villages, I think, the word pagan. But unlike the Jewish people who believed in one God, these pagans believed that there was a variety of gods, and it took a lot of the Greek gods. And these gods controlled nature, so they would sacrifice to try and get a good crop, and they controlled the destiny of man, of humans. It is most likely that the people in Galatia, before they were Christians, probably were pagans, and they worshipped all these gods. And they would have sacrificed these so-called gods in the form of idols. In his letter to the church in Corinth, Paul states that these idols are not really gods at all. Well, obviously they're not. Paul goes on to state that the sacrifices offered by pagans often actually go to demons. And behind them, these spiritual forces from the enemy. And in the West, Most of us don't really believe in a variety of gods that control nature or our destinies. That's the belief is most of us has disappeared. However, as Christians, we recognise there are modern day idols, aren't there? That somehow exert a similar type of control over us and what we do. Now, if we define an idol, I looked it up in the dictionary, if we define it as a person, object, or activity that is given a higher priority in our lives than God, it was a Christian kind of site that I looked it on, then we can start to see how these idols start to control and enslave us. So whether we have a new car or a new house or a career or even another person or even a ministry, these elementary forces that control us and enslave us seem to be similar. If we look at why we or anyone would possibly want to make an inanimate object like a car or even another human being, an idol, then we find two very powerful emotions at work within us. The first emotion is fear. So when we put our trust in anything other than God, it becomes an idol. Begin to spend more and more time and energy on it. It becomes our heart's desire and our greatest fear that somehow will have to live without it. Whether it's money or our looks or our career or even our ministry, we cling on to it for fear of losing it. The second emotion is pride. Now, pride is kind of praise directed to self, isn't it? It leaves us feeling a greater self-worth. Having a healthy set of self-esteem is important for us to function. We are all made in God's image, and God believes we were worth suffering and dying to save. We can't underestimate how precious each one of us is God's sight. However, instead of reflecting the worth God gives us back to Him, pride points inwardly. And gradually, pride starts to change our perception of who we are. If we have idols in our lives, we begin to attach our self-worth to them. Whether it is our job, our possessions, or our abilities, our worth becomes inextricably linked with our idol. Gradually, they begin to define who we are, and we become more and more enslaved. If we, for some reason, should lose our idol, it totally devastates us and our self-esteem. Now, unlike physical addictions, most of us don't see ourselves as being enslaved to idols. We minimize them and excuse them even to those closest to us. However, deep inside, they drive us and they motivate us much of what we say and do. And we just have to watch adverts to see how pride and fear get used so much to get people to buy things. We need the new talking phone to organise our important lives. If not, then our lives are going to fall apart. We're constantly bombarded by things that we need, but often the emotions that would make us even contemplate buying these things are fear and pride. Oh, I need that. To make me look like this, it will make me feel more important. I need that. If I don't have that, then people are going to think this. Or the trouble is, our desires feed the pride and fear, and then fear and pride feed these desires. And yet in the end, we can never be satisfied, and we just become more enslaved. So Paul says the Galatians were enslaved to their idols by elementary forces, and these could include fear and pride. But he doesn't say they or you were enslaved, referring to the Galatians. Yet he says we. We were in slavery under the elementary forces of the world. But Paul was a Jew. What does slavery to idols have to do, through fear and pride, have to do with slavery to the law? Right. The Old Testament law dictated the Jewish people what was right and wrong. It didn't actually give it any power to do what was right and wrong. It just explained what was right and wrong. Most of us have not been brought up in the Jewish law, but some of us may have been brought up with some kind of religious legalism. But the majority of people in the West would rely on our conscience to determine what was right and wrong. Our conscience, like the law in itself, doesn't lead us to do what is right. It just tells us the difference. So if it's not our conscience that motivates us to do right and wrong, what is it that makes any of us do what is good, or what makes us do what is bad? Or, to use an old-fashioned word, and I'll show you why in a second, what makes us virtuous? And I just want to go back to this, an old guy. So this is why I've said the word virtuous. There's a guy called Jonathan Edwards, and some of you might know him. He's, when I say an old guy, he was 300 years old. American preacher and philosopher and theologian. He's not around today, by the way, just in case. And he talks about virtue, and he says there's two types of virtue. And they said the first one is common virtue. Okay? And the second one is true virtue. So, both types of virtue are important to keep society civil, to stop people from killing each other or harming each other. However, both types of virtue have different origins. And I just want to look at this quickly because it just relates to everything. So common virtue, according to Jonathan Edwards, is controlled by two elementary forces. Can we guess what these two elementary forces are? Fear and pride. First, it is controlled by fear. We don't do what we think is wrong because we're afraid of feeling guilty or afraid of the consequences if we get caught. So we just don't do it. The inner voice says something like this: I'm not going to go for a drink with that married lady, or it'll just make me feel guilty. Besides, her husband might find out. So the religious version may be something like this: I'm not going to go for a drink with that lady because God will punish me. Again, it's fear. Yeah? And this is fear is often useful in society as a whole. It's one of the first reactions Adam and Eve had when they disobeyed God. And we know that life is not the end. There is a righteous God who will judge everyone fairly. So to have fear of a righteous God seems like an appropriate response, really, doesn't it? The second motivation for common virtue is pride. So the inner voice goes something like this: I'm not like them. I don't do X, Y, and Z. I do A, B, and C. And it makes us feel good about ourselves, or at least better than them. And the religious version would say something like this: Are you watching God? Are you watching what I'm doing? Seeing what I'm doing for you? Remember this, you owe me. I know. Horrible, isn't it? So according to Jonathan Edwards, for most of us, religious or non-religious, our motivation to do good is either out of pride or fear. Ultimately, then, we are doing good or obeying the law for our own benefit, to either not suffer the negative consequences of doing bad, or to receive the rewards and benefits, such as high self-esteem and status or blessing from God. So if we mix our Christianity with this common virtue, we are left with this kind of bargaining. If we are bad, expect punishment. If we are good, well, God owes us. Our obedience is a way of trying to control God. Ugh. Yet in reality, this is not God. It's a false God who we have created. It is a religious idol. In the end, this idol's, like any other idol, enslaves us, and again, we become enslaved by fear and pride. So what causes true virtue? What's the other type of virtue? What is the true gospel virtue? The true gospel message that saves us from this slavery? Well, let's go back to the text, verse 4. But when the right time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, subject to the law. God sent him to buy freedom for us who were slaves to the law, so that he could adopt us as his very own children. And because we are his children, God has sent his Spirit, the Spirit of his Son, into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, Father. Now you are no longer a slave, but God's own child. And since you are a child, God has made you his heir. The law had its time on earth, and it revealed to the Jewish people they could not obey it, however hard they try. Whether Jew or Gentile, we were born as slaves, under the law, under our conscience, controlled by fear and pride. That was our status, and that was our experience in our life. However, then Jesus came, born of a woman. He was also born under the law, but unlike us, unlike any other human being that has ever lived, he obeyed it perfectly. Why? So he could buy us. So he could redeem us as slaves from under the law. But that isn't it. Not only did he release us from slavery, he adopted us as his very own children. In the original text, the Hebrew phrase means to give the full rights of a son. So not only did God free us from slavery and the punishment of breaking the law, death, he changed our status from slave to son and heir. Yet he hadn't finished. Not only did God make us his children, his sons, God sent his Spirit into our hearts, prompting us to call out, Abba, Father. God sent his Spirit to dwell in our hearts that we may know from experience our sonship. We cry out from our hearts, Abba, Father, Daddy. It is the Spirit of Jesus, the one who obeyed the law perfectly, that comes and lives within us. And as we submit our lives to him, God, by his Spirit, leads and empowers us to live as Jesus did, no longer as slaves, but as his children. We need not have to be slaves to fear and pride any longer. We have been set free, not just by status, but through experience, through the Holy Spirit. Our worth is no longer based on our idols or ability to do good. It is based on the fact that we are God's children and heirs. Paul then asked the church in Galatia, after all that God has done for them, why would you choose to return to slavery? And in verse 8 it says, formerly you did not know God. You were slaves to those by nature are not gods. But now you know God, or rather you are known by him. How is it that you're turning your back to these weak and miserable forces? Now, according to Jonathan Edwards, true virtue, godly virtue, gospel virtue is not based on pride and fear. It is based on a force far greater. It is based on love. It is based on the love of God revealed to us by his Spirit. It is based on the love of God that fills our heart, that motivates our thoughts and actions. While common virtue is based on pride and fear, true virtue is the absence of fear and pride. God's love destroys our fear and pride. Fear and pride cannot exist in the presence of God's love. And if we allow God's love to work in and through us, then those around, those who we come in contact with, will see the true gospel message. Thank you.